What would you do if the men you trusted handed you the torn, blank half of a treasure map and kept the marked half for themselves, laughing while they pocketed what looked like your only chance at a future? In the dust of Ash Hollow, a 24-year-old orphan named Henry Reed took the scrap they threw at him, folded it into his coat, and walked out of that saloon without a word. Everyone in town swore the paper he carried was worth nothing at all. But what waited at the end of those faint, forgotten lines would rewrite a story the frontier had buried 3 generations deep. Settle in, keep the lantern close, and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Because this ride runs through country most men have long since stopped believing in. Ash Hollow sat low in a bend of dry country, hemmed in on the north by red bluffs and on the south by a creek that ran thin most of the year. Henry rode in from the freight road at dusk, with the sun bleeding out behind him and a wind at his back that smelled of sage and old smoke. He had been gone 11 days, driving cattle for a man who paid him in promises and then paid him in less. His coat was pale with dust, his boots had lost their shape at the ankles. The mare beneath him, a slab-sided bay with a white sock and a slow, patient step, was called Juno, and she had been his since he was 17, when the last of his kin had gone into the ground and left him nothing but her. He tied Juno at the rail outside the feed store and stood a moment with one hand on her neck. She turned an ear toward him. She always did. He murmured something too soft to carry and went inside to pay down what he owed on grain. The clerk counted his coins twice, as clerks in Ash Hollow always counted his coins twice, and slid the change back across the plank without meeting his eye. Henry pocketed it, thanked him, and stepped back into the street. He had come home to a letter. The postmaster handed it over without ceremony, an envelope thumbed soft at the corners, addressed in a hand Henry half remembered. His Uncle Ridley, who had never been much of an uncle, and less of a man, had died 3 weeks back in a rooming house east of the ridge. The letter said Ridley had left instructions. It said Henry was named. It said he should present himself at the Hollow's one lawyer's office by the end of the week, or forfeit whatever share was meant for him. Henry read the letter twice, under the failing light, and folded it away. He had not seen Ridley in 9 years. He had not expected to see his name written down by that hand ever again. He walked Juno to the livery, brushed her down himself, though the boy there offered, and slept that night on a pallet behind the tack room, because the boarding house wanted coin he did not care to spend. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called once, and then thought better of it. Henry lay awake with the letter against his ribs, and listened to Juno, breathing on the other side of the wall. Morning came thin and cold. Henry crossed the street to the lawyer's office, with the dust still on his coat. Inside, 2 men were already waiting, and the lawyer, a narrow man named Pruitt, sat behind a desk with a leather folder open before him. The 2 waiting men were Ridley's other kin, sons of a cousin, both older than Henry, and both grinning, like they had already been told the joke. The louder of them was called Boone Harker, wide through the shoulder, red about the neck, a man who took up more room than a room could reasonably give. Pruitt cleared his throat. He explained that Ridley had left one thing of value, and that thing was a map. He explained that Ridley, in his final instructions, had asked that the map be divided in 3 unequal parts among his surviving kin. He explained that the division had already been made according to the deceased's own hand, and that each heir was to draw a folded portion at random from the folder before him. Boone Harker laughed before the drawing even started. He said, loud enough for the street to hear, that the orphan boy could have whatever scrap fell to him and be grateful for it. His brother said nothing, but smiled the same smile. Henry drew last. When the 3 pieces were unfolded on the desk, Boone's showed a heavy black cross at the base of what looked like a stone spire, with distances marked in a firm hand, and a note beneath, in Ridley's cramped script. His brothers showed the trail leading to it, waypoints and water, and the names of 2 creeks. Henry's piece showed a run of faint pencil lines drifting off into empty paper. No cross, no words, no mark of any kind, but a thin curl of ink at one edge that might have been the beginning of a river, or might have been nothing at all. Boone laughed again, longer this time. He said the orphan had drawn his own worth. His brother folded the 2 useful pieces together and tucked them into an inside pocket. Pruitt looked at Henry with something close to pity and said, quietly, that the drawing was binding. Henry picked up his blank half, folded it once, and slid it into his coat beside the letter. He said nothing at all. He walked out into the light. Would you have thrown that paper into the street? Would you have argued, shouted, demanded a second draw? Or would you have done what Henry did, and carried the useless half home in silence, to see what a dead man had meant by it? If a story like this one keeps you up nights, leave a word below, and follow along, because what Henry found when he finally spread that scrap flat on his table by lantern light was not empty at all. It was only waiting to be read the right way. Word of the drawing traveled faster than Henry did. By the time he crossed the square, 2 women outside the dry goods store had already turned their faces to watch him pass, and one of them touched the other's sleeve and murmured something behind a gloved hand. A pair of freighters loading barrels at the loading dock straightened up as he went by, and one of them spat into the dust and grinned at the other in a way that needed no words. The clerk from the feed store stood in his doorway with a rag in his hands and did not lift his eyes when Henry nodded at him. News in Ash Hollow moved the way smoke moved on a still day. Slow and everywhere, and stinging when it settled. At the corner by the smithy, Boone Harker was already telling the story to any man who would stand still for it. He had the 2 folded pieces out and open in his palm, like a winning hand at cards, and he was pointing at the black cross with a thick finger, and laughing the way men laugh who have never had to earn anything twice. He saw Henry cross the road and raised his voice on purpose. "Boy drew paper," Boone said. "Nothing but paper." The smith looked up from his anvil, met Henry's eye a moment, and looked down again. "Maybe he can sell it," Boone went on. "Maybe a hen'll lay on it." A few of the men around him laughed the small, polite laugh of men who did not want to be laughed at next. Henry kept walking. He did not slow, and he did not turn his head, and he did not touch the folded scrap inside his coat. He had learned long ago that answering a mouth like Boone Harker's only fed it. He was almost past the churchyard when the old woman spoke to him. She was seated on the low stone wall at its edge, in a black wool shawl too heavy for the morning, with a cane laid across her knees. Henry knew her only by sight. She had been old when he was small, and she was old still, in the way certain frontier women were old. Not frail, only worn to the grain like a bench nobody meant to replace. Her eyes were the pale, colorless blue of river ice. She lifted the cane an inch off her lap as he came level with her, not to bar his way, but to mark him. "Boy," she said. Henry stopped. "They gave you the empty piece," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him a long moment. Wind moved a strand of white hair against her cheek, and she did not lift a hand to it. "The empty ground is where the old road ran," she said. "Mind you walk it slow." Henry waited to see if there would be more. There was not. She lowered her eyes to the cane in her lap, and the audience she had given him was closed. He touched the brim of his hat to her, and moved on, and by the time he reached the livery, he could not have said, if pressed, whether she had spoken of his map or of some older thing entirely. Behind him, at the smithy, Boone Harker was still talking, and the laughter of the men rose and fell like a small, dry weather. Henry walked into the livery and stood a moment in its shadow before he went for Juno's stall. The mare turned her head and blew out a long, soft breath against his coat, and it was the first honest greeting he had had all morning. He set his hand on her neck and stood there until his shoulders eased down out of his ears, and then he went to fetch her saddle. He did not go into town again that day. Henry's place, if it could be called that, was a 2-room cabin an hour's ride west of Ash Hollow. At the low edge of a stand of yellow pine his uncle Ridley had once run cattle through in better years. The cabin had come to Henry by nothing more official than nobody else wanting it. He had patched its roof twice and its door once, and the stove drew crooked but drew. He rode out to it, with the sun climbing at his back, and the folded scrap warm against his ribs, and Boone Harker's laughter, still faintly in his ear, like a fly he could not swat. The land changed as he rode. The country west of Ash Hollow rose in long, shallow steps toward the timber, and the grass thinned, and the soil went from red to a paler bone color, and the wind, when it came, smelled less of dust and more of pine sap and cold stone. Juno picked her own pace. Henry did not push her. He watched the horizon the way a man watches a face he is trying to remember. And he thought about the old woman's line, and he thought about the thin curl of ink at the edge of the paper, folded into his coat. And he thought about nothing at all, in the way a man thinks about nothing when his hands are on the reins and the reins are steady. It was past noon when he came in sight of the cabin. It looked, as it always looked, like something the country had begun to take back and then lost interest in. The chimney leaned a hair to the north. The pine shakes had gone silver. A single window on the south wall caught the light and threw it dully back at him. And beyond the cabin, the pines stood in their patient ranks, dark green shading to blue, where the shadow gathered under them. He unsaddled Juno at the lean-to and rubbed her down and turned her into the small pole corral, where the grass, thin as it was better than nothing. He carried his saddle inside and set it in its corner. He built up the stove from the coals he had banked before he left for the drive. He put water on. He did all of this before he took the scrap out of his coat, because a man who has been laughed at in the morning does not run at anything in the afternoon, not even a piece of paper his uncle had meant for him alone. When the water was hot, he made coffee. He sat down at the plank table by the south window and drew the folded half of the map from his coat and laid it flat in front of him. In the honest light of day, it looked, if anything, emptier than it had on Pruitt's desk. Faint pencil lines wandered across the paper and lost themselves. The thin curl of ink at the torn edge stopped where his uncle's knife had stopped. There was no cross. There were no words. There was nothing a man could ride toward. Henry looked at it a long time. Then he folded it back along its crease and set it under the lantern on the table. And he went out to split wood for the evening, because his hands wanted work more than his head wanted answers. He split until the light went orange in the pines, and the wind cooled on his neck. He came in at dusk, ate cold bread and coffee, lit the lantern, and sat down across from the scrap of paper, as a man sits down across from a stranger he has decided to wait out. Outside, an owl called once from the timber, and did not call again. Juno shifted in the corral. The stove ticked. Henry did not move. He watched the paper the way he had watched the horizon, patient as weather, and slowly, in the low, warm light of the lantern, something on the paper began to answer him back. It was not ink. It was not pencil. It was the ghost of both, faint marks that only spoke when the lantern was low enough and close enough, and the eye had stopped hunting for a cross. Henry leaned forward. Along the wandering pencil lines, at intervals he had at first taken for smudges, Small round scorch points showed where a heated pin or a fine needle had touched the paper and left a tan freckle no bigger than a grain of oat. He had missed them in daylight, because daylight flattened everything. Under the lantern, the freckles cast their own tiny shadows. He counted 7 along the longest line, then 4 along a shorter one that broke away from it toward the torn edge. At the end of the shorter line, tucked against the tear itself, was a mark that was not a freckle. It was a letter. It was so small he had to lower the lantern until the chimney nearly touched the paper. An R. Just the one. Cut with a knife tip, so thin it had gone through only the top skin of the paper and left no ink at all, only a scratched shine that caught the flame. Henry sat back. He did not smile. He did not speak. He only looked at the R for a long while, the way a man looks at a footprint on ground he thought he was alone on. His Uncle Ridley had not written a name where a name should be. His uncle had written a name where nobody would think to look, on the piece nobody would think to keep. Henry lowered the wick a little, and the freckles brightened, and he saw for the first time that the wandering pencil lines were not aimless at all. They ran in the shape of ground, a dry wash bending south, a saddle between 2 low hills, a finger of timber. He had ridden country like it 100 times without a map. He had ridden some of it this very afternoon. The paler, bone-colored soil, the stand of yellow pine, the old road the woman at the churchyard had spoken of, that had run where nothing ran now. He did not act. He did not fetch a pen to trace over what he had seen. And he did not go to the door to look west into the dark. He folded the scrap the way he had folded it before, along its one honest crease, and slid it beneath the tin plate on the table so the lantern's heat would not curl it. Then he blew out the lantern and lay down on the pallet by the stove in his clothes. Outside, Juno shifted once in the corral and was still. Henry lay awake a long time, listening for the owl. It did not call again. He slept toward morning and dreamt of freckles of light on water. He rose before the sun. He fed the stove, boiled coffee, and stood at the south window while the pines went from black to gray to green. He did not take the scrap out again. He knew where the R was now, and he knew what an R at the end of a line meant when a man had spent his last months writing instructions to kin he could not speak to in life. But he also knew that a man who runs at a thing because it flatters him arrives at that thing with nothing in his hands but hope, and hope did not saddle a horse or split a fence rail. So Henry ate. He drank his coffee. He went out to the corral and put his hand on Juno's neck. Juno pressed her forehead once against his coat, which was how she said good morning, and blew warm air along his sleeve. That day Henry did not ride west. He mended the corral instead. 2 of the pole rails had sagged in the 11 days he had been gone driving cattle, and the gate latch had rusted through its eye. He set the sagging rails first, cutting new lodgepole from a downed pine at the timber's edge, and dragging the length back with a rope hitched to Juno's saddle horn. Juno pulled slow and steady, her white sock flashing in the grass, her breath rolling out of her in even clouds. When Henry unhitched her at the corral, she stood exactly where he left her, until he came to lead her away, which was another of her habits, and one he had never taught her. He notched the new rail into the posts with a chisel he had inherited from a man whose name he no longer said aloud, and he thought while he worked about the pale, bone-colored soil, and how it lay only in certain draws west of the cabin, and how the finger of timber on the paper matched a finger of timber he could see from his own doorway if he stood at the right angle. He fixed the latch next. He heated the eye at the stove, pounded it true on a flat stone he kept by the door for that purpose, and reset it. His hands, dark and split at the knuckles, moved without asking his head for orders. While he worked, small things settled into place behind his eyes. The old woman had said the empty ground was where the old road ran. Ridley had not lived in Ash Hollow in Henry's memory, but Ridley had once run cattle through the yellow pine, and cattle followed old roads before they followed new ones. Boone Harker's piece had shown a stone spire with a cross at its base. There was no stone spire west of the cabin that Henry knew of, but Boone Harker's piece did not need to be wrong for Henry's piece to be right. Ridley had cut the map with a purpose. A man who cut a map into 3 unequal pieces and put a name on only one of them, and put that name where nobody would look, was a man saying something to one heir and something else to the others. By afternoon, Henry was in the lean-to sharpening the axe. Juno stood at the corral rail, watching him, one ear forward and one ear turned back toward the timber. He noticed her ear. He noticed everything about her now, because she had begun, in her quiet way, to notice things too. She had turned her head west 3 times that morning, without cause he could see, and once she had blown out a long, slow breath, the way she did when a rider she knew was coming up a road she could not yet see. Henry ran the stone along the axe edge and watched her and said nothing. At dusk he oiled the chisel, the axe, and the old skinning knife his uncle had once given him when he was a boy, and he laid all 3 on the plank table, beside the tin plate, under which the scrap of paper waited. He ate. He banked the stove. He went to bed early. He would need the morning. Morning came gray and windless. Henry saddled Juno while the pines still held the night in their lower branches, and by the time the first ridge of light crossed the corral, he was already on the old road that the old road was no longer. He rode west, then southwest, holding to a line the paper had drawn under his skin. The scrap itself was folded inside his coat again, against the letter, against his ribs. He did not need to look at it. He had counted 7 scorch points along one line, and he counted them now under his tongue, the way another man might count paces or prayers. The bone-colored soil began at the second draw. Juno's hooves changed sound on it. Henry felt her ears come forward and stay. He let her choose the ground where the ground was hers to choose. They crossed a dry wash bending south, and there, where the wash flattened into a shallow saddle between 2 low hills, Henry saw the finger of timber the paper had drawn. He dismounted. He walked Juno in by the reins. Inside the finger of timber the air was cooler by 10 degrees. Yellow pine stood in even rows, too even for wild growth. A man had planted them. A long time ago, a man had planted them in lines that only revealed themselves when a rider stood in the right place and looked down the right corridor. Henry stood in the right place. He looked down the right corridor. At the end of it, half buried in duff and years, was a low mound of dressed stone. Not a spire, not a cross, a wellhead. The stones were fitted without mortar, weathered pale, and moss had crept along the north seams. A wooden cap lay across it, split in one place, weighted with a flat river stone that no river within a day's ride ran round. Henry did not rush. He tied Juno to a pine and walked the rest of the way slow. He lifted the river stone off. He lifted the split cap. The dark inside the well smelled of cold rock and old iron, not water. A rope led down into it, tarred against rot, tied to an iron ring set in the top course. He pulled the rope hand over hand. It came up heavier than a rope should. At the end of it hung an oilskin bundle bound in cord, and inside the oilskin, when he unwrapped it there in the light under the yellow pines, was a tin box the length of his forearm. Inside the tin, folded in wax paper, was a ledger. Inside the ledger, in Ridley's cramped script, were the names of 42 head of horses, driven up out of the border country, in a year Henry had been a boy, the bills of sale for each, the brands recorded and re-recorded, and beneath the last entry, a single line. "This is the herd they said I stole." Here is where I hid what proved I did not. To the one who reads slow enough to find it, the rest is yours. Beneath the ledger lay a smaller packet, coin, not much, enough, and a folded deed to 80 acres of pine, in Ridley's name, transferable, unregistered, waiting. Henry sat down on the well-stones. He put his hand flat on the ledger and left it there a long time. Juno cropped at nothing behind him. The wind moved in the tops of the pines and did not come down. He wrapped it all back into the oilskin, as he had found it, but he carried it out in his arms, and not on the rope. He rode home in a light he had not seen the country wear before. The sky changed while he rode. By the time he crossed the second draw, the west had gone the color of a bruise, and the wind that had held off all morning came down out of the pines in one long cold shove. Henry felt the first hard flakes strike his hat before he saw them. Spring snow, the kind that killed lambs and travelers who trusted the season. Juno lowered her head and pushed into it. He was still a quarter-mile from the cabin when he saw the shape by the fence line. At first he took it for a downed calf. Then he saw the second shape, smaller, huddled against the first. Then he heard the sound a child makes when a child has stopped crying, because crying costs too much air. Henry swung down. A woman lay against the lower rail of his own pasture fence, one arm across a boy of maybe 6. Her lips were the wrong color. The boy's eyes were open and did not track. A tipped-over handcart lay 10 yards off in the grass with a broken wheel. She tried to speak and could not make the shape of the word. Henry did not ask questions. He lifted the boy first, because the boy was lighter and colder, and set him across Juno's withers inside his own coat. He got the woman up next, half over his shoulder, half walking, her boots dragging. The snow came sideways now. Juno stood without being told, and walked without being led, straight toward the cabin she knew. Inside, Henry laid the boy on the pallet by the stove, and stripped the wet wool off him, and wrapped him in the dry blanket from his own bed. He set the woman in the chair nearest the stove, and pulled her boots off, and rubbed her feet between his hands, until she gasped at the return of feeling. He fed the stove until the iron sang. He put water on. He crumbled the last of the bread into hot milk from the tin, and spooned it into the boy first, then the woman. She said, when she could speak, that her name did not matter, that her husband had died on the trail 2 weeks back of a fever, that she had been walking toward a sister in a town whose name she gave and Henry knew was still 40 miles off. She said the wheel had broken at noon. She said she had not known there was a cabin. Henry said, "You're here now." She began to cry then, quietly, into her hands, and the boy slept against the stove with his fist closed on the edge of the blanket. Henry stood at the south window and watched the snow come down over the corral, where Juno stood, already blanketed and calm, and he thought of the oilskin bundle laid on the plank table behind him, and of Ridley, and of 42 horses, and of a well that had held the truth of a man for longer than a boy had been alive. He would ride to town tomorrow if the snow let him. He would ride to town whether it did or not. The snow let up before dawn. Henry rose while the woman and the boy still slept, banked the stove high, split enough wood to last them a day, and left a note on the table, telling them to eat what was in the tin and stay by the fire. He saddled Juno in the blue light. The oilskin bundle rode inside his coat now, in the place where the letter and the map scrap had ridden before it. Juno stepped through drifts that reached her knees in the low places, breathing steady, choosing her own footing. The sun came up behind them and turned the pines to copper. Ash Hollow was quiet when Henry rode in. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimneys. He tied Juno at the rail outside Pruitt's office and went in without knocking. Pruitt was at his desk with a cup of coffee cooling by his elbow. He looked up and did not speak. Henry set the oilskin bundle on the desk and unwrapped it slowly, the way a man uncovers a body for a doctor. Pruitt read the ledger without touching it. He read for a long time. Then he read the deed. Then he read the note beneath the last entry. His mouth moved once, but he made no sound. "You know this hand," Henry said. "I know it," Pruitt murmured. "Is it good?" Pruitt looked up. "It is good." He said the deed was clean, that the 80 acres of pine had lain unregistered, because Ridley had never wanted his name on a public book while the horse charge hung over him, that the bills of sale would clear that charge in any court between the ridge and the border, and that the 42 head had a story now that closed. He said it quietly, the way a man says a thing he has been waiting years to be able to say. Word carried out of the office, the way word always carried in Ash Hollow. By the time Henry came back onto the plank walk, 3 men were already standing near Juno, with their hats in their hands. The clerk from the feed store crossed the square, with his rag still over his shoulder, and looked Henry in the face, and nodded once, and Henry nodded back. 2 women outside the dry goods store did not whisper. The smith stepped out from his forge and lifted a hand. Boone Harker came out of the saloon near noon. He walked slower than a man walks when he has been drinking. He walked the way a man walks toward a fence he has to climb. He stopped 6 feet from Henry in the middle of the square. His 2 folded pieces of the map were in his hand. He held them out. "I was wrong about you," Boone Harker said. Henry looked at the pieces and did not take them. "Keep them," he said. "They're yours. They don't lead anywhere." They lead where he said they lead. That was his to give. Boone Harker's throat worked. He put the pieces back into his coat. "The boy," he said, and stopped. "The orphan boy. I shouldn't have said." "It's done," Henry said. Boone Harker nodded, and nodded again, and walked back the way he had come, but slower now, and without the red in his neck. His brother, silent still, watched from the saloon door and touched the brim of his hat to Henry once before he turned inside. Outsiders began arriving within the week. A land agent rode in from the county seat to record the deed. A gray-haired lawyer came up from the border country with a folio under his arm and sat 2 hours with Pruitt going over the bills of sale, and left, saying, plainly, and to whoever would hear, that Ridley's name was clear. A man who had ridden with Ridley in the year of the 42 head came to the cabin, took his hat off inside the door, and stood a long time by the plank table without speaking. He left a small carved horse of pine on the table before he went. The woman and the boy stayed 9 days. On the 3rd day, the boy followed Henry to the corral and put his hand on Juno's white sock and did not flinch when she lowered her great head to breathe against his hair. On the 9th day, Henry hitched a borrowed wagon and drove them the 40 miles to the sister's town himself, with the boy asleep against his shoulder for the last hour. The woman took his hand at the sister's gate and did not let go for a long moment. She said, "We will not forget." Henry said, "Nor I." He rode home alone through country that was already greening under the melt. Juno walked the last mile without being asked, straight to the corral gate, and stood while he unsaddled her, and pressed her forehead once against his coat, the way she had pressed it the morning after the lantern. By the end of the season, Henry had begun clearing a lane through the 80 acres of pine, along the line of the old road the woman at the churchyard had named. He worked alone most days. Sometimes the smith's eldest boy rode out to help him for the price of a meal and the use of the axe. The wellhead in the finger of timber he left as it was, capped and weighted, though he cleared the duff back from its stones, so a man walking that way would see it. On an evening in late summer, Henry stood at the south window of the cabin, with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, and watched the light go long across the pasture. The pines beyond the corral were black at their trunks and gold at their crowns. Juno stood at the rail with one ear forward and one ear turned back toward the timber, the way she had stood the day before he first rode west. The oilskin bundle was in a tin under the floorboards now, and the deed was in the county book, and the ledger was in a drawer in Pruitt's desk, under a key Henry had been given a copy of and had never used. The smith's boy was outside, splitting kindling, and came in to set it by the stove. He looked at Henry a moment and asked, plain, "What'd you build out here, mister?" Henry thought about it. He set the coffee down. "A place a man's name comes home to," he said. The boy nodded as if he understood, though he did not yet, and went back out into the last of the light. Henry stood at the window a while longer. The sun touched the ridge and held there. Juno lowered her head to the grass. Somewhere in the finger of timber, an owl called once, and this time a second owl answered from farther off, and the two of them spoke back and forth across the pines until the light was gone. "Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If the quiet weight of a man carrying a name back into the light stayed with you the way it stayed with me, leave a word in the comments, tap the like, and follow along for the next story waiting down the road. Ride easy until then."